My husband left me for a younger lover, then begged to return after I became rich. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. The rain tasted like copper and engine oil the night my ex-husband crawled back to my warehouse, begging for his life. The storm was a torrential, blinding sheet of gray water that battered the corrugated steel roof of my sanctuary like the drumline of the damned. I stood just inside the massive, 50-foot rolling bay doors, the heavy, grease-stained chain of the industrial hoist cold and grounding against my calloused palm. Out there in the freezing deluge stood Mark. 7 years ago, he was a man who wore bespoke Italian wool and a predatory smile that could disarm a firing squad. He was the architect of his own grand illusions. Tonight, however, he was nothing but a soaked, shivering ghost. His once expensive trench coat was plastered to a body that looked physically hollowed out by panic, sleeplessness, and mounting, suffocating debt. He was shouting something over the roar of the winter storm, his words violently snatched away by the wind, but his posture, the slumped, defeated shoulders, the desperate, pathetic upward angle of his face, spoke volumes. This was a man whose entire structural foundation had catastrophically collapsed. I didn't press the button to let him in immediately. I stood in the shadows, breathing in the smell of cut steel and welding ozone from my shop floor, and I just let him stand in the freezing downpour. I let the cold seep deep into his bones, because I needed him to feel just a fraction of the freezing, desolate reality he handed me when I was 35. Back then, he didn't just walk away from our marriage. He structurally dismantled my entire existence. He methodically removed every single load-bearing pillar of our life together until the roof violently caved in on me, leaving me trapped in the rubble. I watched the dirty rainwater run down his graying, sunken face, and a memory flashed behind my eyes with the sharp, blinding, retina-burning crack of an arc welder. The day he left, I remember the sterile, flickering fluorescent lighting of our cramped kitchen. I remember the cold, mechanical, utterly detached way he looked at me, listing my supposed flaws like a building inspector condemning a property. He told me I was stagnant, uninspired, too covered in the dust of practical labor to fit into the sleek, modern penthouse of the future he felt he deserved. He packed his designer leather duffel bags with terrifying efficiency and introduced his new reality, a 24-year-old named Chloe. A girl with impossibly smooth skin, empty eyes, and absolutely 0 miles on her odometer. He walked out the door to start his shiny new life, leaving me holding the deed to a gutted, toxic, dilapidated industrial property he had secretly leveraged against our entire financial future. I remember the visceral, physical sickness of that day, the taste of stale coffee, the burning in my throat, and the coppery, metallic tang of my own bitten lip as I realized I was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of his hidden debt. Now, 7 years later, the smell of the air was entirely different. It was the heavy, magnificent scent of my empire. Behind me stretched 40,000 square feet of meticulously restored architectural salvage, a multi-million-dollar kingdom I had literally built by bleeding onto the exact soot, iron, and broken bricks he had abandoned me to die in. I am Clara. I work with iron, reclaimed wood, and the heavy weight of history. I take things that have been systematically destroyed and I throw them into the fire, forging them into something completely unbreakable. But looking at Mark, shivering pitifully under the harsh glare of my halogen security lights, I knew some things were completely beyond repair. Some structures, no matter how much you try to patch the drywall, are so deeply, fundamentally rotten at their core that the only logical engineering solution is a total, controlled demolition. I finally reached out and hit the heavy red industrial button on the concrete wall. The steel bay doors began to grind upward with a piercing, metallic scream, exposing his pathetic, soaked figure fully to the warm, amber glow of my world. He took a hesitant, trembling step forward, his eyes wide, calculating and desperate, stepping out of the freezing rain and into the mouth of the furnace. He was about to ask me for a second chance, unaware he had walked onto a demolition site. The sterile, flickering fluorescent lighting of our old kitchen still haunts the periphery of my vision when the warehouse gets too quiet. It was a Tuesday, the kind of deeply unremarkable, gray afternoon where tragedies feel entirely out of place. I was 35, my hands stained with wood varnish from trying to restore an antique credenza to sell for our mortgage payment, while Mark stood perfectly pristine in a tailored suit that cost more than my car. He didn't scream. He didn't throw plates or stage a melodramatic, tearful confession. The absolute horror of his discard lay in its cold, mechanical efficiency. He stood by the granite island we had picked out together, holding a leather briefcase, and dismantled our 15-year partnership with the detached, soulless precision of a corporate liquidator dissolving a bankrupt subsidiary. "You're dragging me down, Clara," he said, his voice flat, devoid of a single ounce of empathy or hesitation. "I am building a legacy. I am moving into the upper echelons of the city's real estate market, and you, look at you. You smell like sawdust and old paint. You've completely let yourself go. We don't fit the same blueprint anymore." He didn't even look me in the eye as he said it. He was busy checking his gold Rolex, irritated that the emotional destruction of his wife was making him late for dinner. The air in the room felt impossibly thin, as if the oxygen had been violently sucked out through the ventilation shafts. I tried to speak, to ask him about the vows, the decade of me working 3 jobs so he could finish his business degree, the sacrifices that had literally aged me while he remained polished and protected. But before I could force the words through my tightening throat, he delivered the final, bone-breaking blow. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with a manicured finger, and showed me a photo. It was Chloe, 24 years old. Big, vacuous eyes, expensive lip filler, draped in designer clothes purchased with money I now know he had siphoned from our joint accounts. "This is Chloe," he stated, as if introducing a new business partner. "She understands the vision. She's my soulmate. My attorney has already drafted the papers. I'm taking the liquid assets. You can keep the title to that useless, gutted warehouse down by the docks. Consider it a favor." I remember the exact physical sensation of that moment. My stomach dropped like a severed elevator cable. The warehouse he was so generously leaving me was a toxic, dilapidated nightmare. A massive brick tomb he had purchased on a whim as a development project and then promptly abandoned when the zoning laws changed. I didn't know it yet, but the property was chained to a mountain of predatory liens and unpaid back taxes. He wasn't giving me a severance package. He was handing me a live grenade, tying me to the detonator, and walking away. I watched him zip his bag, his face an impenetrable mask of narcissistic satisfaction. He genuinely believed he was the hero of his own story, cutting away the dead weight to soar into the stratosphere with a younger, shinier trophy. He walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind him with the finality of a prison cell. I stood alone in the flickering kitchen, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing sickeningly with the harsh scent of the ammonia I had used to clean the floors for him. The silence was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. I looked down at my varnish-stained hands, the hands he had just called useless and ugly. I was 35 years old, entirely alone, and legally tethered to a collapsing ruin. I closed my eyes and tasted ash, realizing I was entirely buried alive under his debts. The immediate aftermath of the discard was a masterclass in visceral, bone-deep survival. Within 3 weeks, the bank foreclosed on the starter home. The liquid assets Mark took turned out to be every single dollar we had to our names, systematically drained through a maze of offshore transfers and hidden gambling debts he used to impress his new, high-maintenance plaything. With absolutely nowhere else to go, I packed my meager remaining clothes into garbage bags and moved into the belly of the beast, the abandoned industrial warehouse. It was late November, and the city was locked in a brutal, wet freeze. The warehouse was a cavernous, 40,000-square-foot nightmare of cracked concrete, shattered skylights, and exposed, rusting steel girders. There was no heating, no functional plumbing, and the wind howled through the broken brickwork like a pack of starving wolves. My first night there remains etched into my nervous system as a physical trauma. I huddled on a cheap, damp mattress in the center of the main floor, swathed in 3 layers of sweaters and a rigid, moth-eaten sleeping bag. I could see my own breath billowing in the freezing air, illuminated by the harsh, blue glow of the street lamps filtering through the shattered glass above. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the dripping of a leaky pipe and the terrifying, hollow echo of my own heartbeat. I was drowning. The mail began to arrive at the rusted chain-link fence outside, a relentless, daily avalanche of red-inked notices. Foreclosures, tax liens, defaulted bridge loans. Mark had forged my signature on personal guarantees, leveraging my credit to the absolute breaking point to fund his illusion of wealth. I was over $600,000 in the red. I remember sitting on an overturned plastic bucket, staring at a final notice from the IRS, the paper trembling in my frostbitten fingers. The pain of the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was a heavy, physical crushing sensation in my chest, a cold iron band tightening around my lungs. I hadn't just lost a husband. I had lost my future, my security, and my dignity. I had spent my entire youth building his foundation, and he had demolished it while I was sleeping inside. For a week, I didn't speak. I barely ate. I survived on stale bread and the bitter, metallic taste of tap water from a rusted utility sink. I let the darkness of the warehouse consume me, crying until my eyes were swollen shut and my throat bled. I wanted to give up. I wanted to lie down on the freezing concrete and let the winter finish the job Mark had started. But the cold has a funny way of clarifying the mind. The cold strips away the bullshit, the self-pity, and the illusions. You either freeze to death, or you find a way to start a fire. On the 8th day, shivering violently, I stood up. The warehouse smelled of centuries-old industrial grease, wet brick, and raw ozone. It was a graveyard of broken things. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, tracing the massive, load-bearing steel columns and the intricate, wrought iron trusses holding up the roof, a tiny, defiant spark ignited in the frozen wasteland of my chest. I wiped the frost from my face, deciding I would rather burn the world than freeze. The spark became an inferno the afternoon I found the iron. I was clearing out a collapsed section of the rear loading dock, tearing at rotted timber with bare, bleeding hands to find something, anything, I could burn for warmth. The physical labor was brutal. Every muscle in my back screamed. My fingernails were cracked and black with century-old soot, and the freezing dust coated my lungs like ground glass. As I hurled a massive, splintered beam aside, my crowbar struck something solid. A sharp, resonant clang echoed through the empty cavern of the warehouse. I dropped to my knees, digging through the debris, the wet ash, and the rat droppings. Buried under decades of neglect was a massive, intricately forged cast-iron architectural corbel from the Gilded Age. It was incredibly heavy, completely coated in a thick crust of orange rust, and undeniably beautiful. It was a structural element meant to hold up massive weight, discarded and forgotten, just like me. I dragged it out into the pale, anemic winter sunlight filtering through the broken windows. I found a wire brush, a bottle of chemical solvent, and an angle grinder left behind by whatever failed contractor Mark had hired years ago. I plugged the grinder into the single working outlet, the machine roaring to life with a violent, electric snarl. For 6 hours, I worked on that piece of iron. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for water. The grinder shot brilliant, blinding showers of orange sparks into the dark air, smelling fiercely of ozone and vaporized metal. I poured every ounce of my rage, my grief, and my humiliation into the grinding wheel. I scrubbed away the rot, the neglect, and the decay. When I finally cut the power, my hands were blistered, my arms were vibrating with exhaustion, and my face was painted black with soot. But sitting in front of me was a masterpiece. The rust was gone, revealing the raw, dark, magnificent luster of the original cast iron. The sheer, brutal resilience of the metal stared back at me. It hadn't been destroyed by the dark. It had just been waiting to be uncovered. That was the moment the tears permanently stopped. That was the moment the soft, accommodating wife died, and the architect of my vengeance was born. If I could restore this single piece of iron, I could restore the entire building. If I could restore the building, I could sell the architectural salvage trapped within its bones. I started tearing the warehouse apart, piece by piece. I harvested massive, old-growth timber beams, antique brass fixtures, and miles of reclaimed brick. I worked until my hands bled, taped them up, and kept working. The physical toll was agonizing, but the pain grounded me. Every swing of the sledgehammer, every spark from the welder, was a violent rejection of the victimhood Mark had assigned me. I wasn't going to let his debts bury me. I was going to use the exact ruins he dumped me in to build a fortress so high, so completely unassailable that he would look like an insect from the top of its walls. The fire was lit, and I was prepared to forge my new empire in the flames. The climb was not a montage set to upbeat music. It was a grueling, multi-year war of attrition waged in blood, sweat, and concrete dust. I lived in that warehouse for 3 years. I bought a cheap, heavy-duty welding rig and taught myself how to fuse steel. I negotiated ruthlessly with commercial buyers, selling them the industrial history I was exhuming from the rubble. The turning point arrived on a sweltering Tuesday in July, in the form of a man named Marcus. He walked into my bay doors smoking an unfiltered cigarette, a 50-something, heavily scarred foreman who looked like he had been carved out of a cinder block. He had heard rumors about a crazy woman down by the docks hoarding premium, old-growth architectural salvage. Marcus didn't care about my past, my gender, or my debts. He only cared about the structural integrity of my materials and the unyielding hardness in my eyes. "You've got good bones here, kid," he rasped, crushing his cigarette under a steel-toed boot. "But you're working like a dog without a blueprint. You need a crew, and you need scale." Marcus became my mentor, my foreman, and my closest ally. We formed a partnership forged in the heat of the cutting torch. We didn't just sell salvage anymore. We began buying other condemned industrial spaces, gutting them, and transforming them into ultra-luxurious, brutalist lofts that the city's wealthy elite fought over. My knowledge of structural dynamics and historical restoration became a heavily sought-after commodity. The money started flowing, not in a trickle, but in a massive, unstoppable concrete pour. I paid off the IRS. I cleared the predatory liens. I settled every single cent of the debt Mark had strapped to my back, demanding legally binding, notarized receipts of release. As the business caught fire, I hardened. The soft edges of my personality calcified into something resembling the steel I worked with. I upgraded my wardrobe from paint-stained overalls to sharp, custom-tailored blazers and dark silk. I moved into the penthouse of the first building Marcus and I successfully developed. But I never sold the original warehouse. I turned it into the multi-million-dollar headquarters of my empire, a cathedral of iron and glass, keeping the heavy bay doors exactly as they were to remind me of where I started. By my 42nd birthday, I was completely untouchable. I was a force of nature in the city's real estate development sector, feared by contractors and respected by the elite. I commanded boardrooms with the same cold, calculating efficiency Mark had used in our kitchen. I had built a fortress, impenetrable and vast, completely insulated from the financial anxiety that had once choked me. But even at the top of the tower, the air carries whispers. The elite loved to gossip, and the rumors about Mark's impending collapse tasted incredibly sweet. The whispers started subtly at first, drifting across the dim, ambient lighting of high-end charity galas and exclusive real estate mixers. I would be standing by a bar, a glass of vintage bourbon in my hand, listening to the city's power brokers exchange information like currency. Mark had spent years trying to aggressively claw his way into this exact circle, using my stolen savings to buy the right suits and lease the right luxury cars. For a while, the illusion held. He and his 24-year-old prize, Chloe, were a fixture in the society pages, grinning with perfectly capped teeth on the decks of rented yachts. But the structural integrity of a life built entirely on debt and deceit is always doomed to catastrophic failure. You cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, and Mark had run out of concrete. The rumors grew louder, sharper. "Did you hear about Vance Properties?" a banking executive murmured to me one evening. "Massive defaults. The guy is leveraged to the hilt, taking out predatory bridge loans just to cover the interest on his mortgages." The young, beautiful Chloe, it turned out, had an insatiable appetite for the lifestyle Mark had promised her. She was bleeding him completely dry, demanding custom jewelry, first-class flights to Milan, and a lifestyle that required a billionaire's bank account, not a grifter's credit limit. When the real estate market experienced a slight, predictable contraction, Mark's entire house of cards was exposed to the wind. Investors pulled out. The banks started calling in the loans. I hired a private investigator, a quiet, ruthless ex-auditor, to pull the public records, not out of longing, but out of a dark, cold, purely analytical fascination. I sat in my expansive, glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline, reading the red ink on the dossier. It was a bloodbath. Foreclosure notices on his leased penthouse. Repossession orders for his imported cars. A massive, looming bankruptcy filing. Mark was drowning, suffocating under the exact same crushing weight of financial terror he had so casually dumped on me 7 years ago. I felt no pity. I felt no sadness. What I felt was a deep, quiet, profoundly satisfying sense of cosmic geometry locking perfectly into place. Karma isn't a mystical force. It's just the inevitable, mathematical consequence of structural failure. He was losing everything because he fundamentally lacked the substance required to maintain it. He had bet his entire existence on a shiny facade, while I had spent the last 7 years reinforcing my load-bearing walls. I closed the dossier, the heavy paper sliding across my polished mahogany desk, and went back to running my empire. I had no intention of reaching out to watch him burn. But the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and predators always return to old hunting grounds. I saw him on a Tuesday, exactly 7 years after the discard. The day was crisp, the winter air biting and sharp, smelling of impending snow and expensive exhaust fumes. I was exiting the massive, marble-columned lobby of the city's most exclusive private bank, having just finalized a multi-million-dollar acquisition of a historic downtown theater. I was wearing a charcoal wool coat that draped perfectly, a structured leather bag over my shoulder, moving with the quiet, unquestionable authority of someone who owns the ground they walk on. And there he was, Mark. He was standing near the revolving doors, arguing frantically with a junior loan officer who looked profoundly uncomfortable. The physical deterioration of the man was shocking, a visceral testament to the rot inside him. He was only 45, but he looked a decade older. The sharp, arrogant jawline had softened into sagging jowls. His hair, once perfectly styled, was thinning and visibly graying at the temples. But it was his clothes that told the real story. He was wearing an expensive suit, but it was from 3 seasons ago. The collar of his shirt was faintly frayed. He looked like a man desperately trying to hold onto the ghost of his former wealth. As I walked past, the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echoing off the marble floor, he turned. Our eyes locked. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly satisfying. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes wide, rapidly scanning my tailored clothes, my posture, and the deference of the bank manager walking beside me. The cognitive dissonance hitting his brain was almost visible. He was looking at the woman he had discarded as worthless, the woman he had buried in debt and dust, and realizing she was now a titan standing at the very peak of the mountain he was currently tumbling down. He took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively reaching out, a pathetic, desperate reflex. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former buttery confidence. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a grimace or a smile. I simply looked right through him, my gaze as cold and unyielding as the iron corbels holding up my warehouse, and walked out through the revolving glass doors into the freezing, bracing air of my city. I climbed into the back of my waiting car, the heavy door shutting with a solid, expensive thud, leaving him trapped inside the glass lobby of his failures. I knew the absolute silence of my rejection would eat him alive, and I was right. It took exactly 48 hours for the absolute audacity to manifest. I was in the warehouse, the heavy smell of welding ozone and hot metal filling the air, reviewing architectural blueprints with Marcus on a steel drafting table. My phone, resting on the blueprints, buzzed with a sharp, intrusive vibration. I glanced down at the screen. It was an unknown number, but the preview text was a language I instantly recognized. It was the desperate, manipulative syntax of a drowning man. "Clara, seeing you the other day, it brought everything back. I've made so many mistakes. I was blind. We need to talk. Please." I stared at the glowing letters, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it almost making me laugh out loud. "What is it?" Marcus rasped, lighting a cigarette and leaning over the table, his scarred face illuminated by the harsh overhead light. "A ghost," I replied coldly, sliding the phone into my pocket. Mark didn't want to apologize. Mark didn't miss me. Mark had just run a background check of his own after seeing me at the bank. He had looked up my company. He had seen the net worth, the massive property holdings, the absolute financial invulnerability I now possessed. His 24-year-old soulmate had undoubtedly bled him dry and abandoned the sinking ship the moment the credit cards started declining. He was facing total ruin, standing on the edge of the abyss and looking for a lifeline. And in his twisted, narcissistic mind, he actually believed that the woman he had emotionally and financially slaughtered 7 years ago was still naive enough to throw him a rope. I didn't reply, but the silence didn't deter him. It only made him more desperate. Over the next 2 weeks, the pathetic siege began. He found out where my active job sites were. I would pull up to a high-rise restoration project, the air thick with concrete dust and the roar of heavy machinery, and see him standing across the street, collar turned up against the cold, watching me with sad, puppy dog eyes. He was trying to weaponize nostalgia. He mailed a handwritten letter to my corporate office, a sickening, overly poetic essay about our struggle years and how he realized, too late, that I was the only woman who ever truly understood his soul. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, carefully omitting the fact that he was currently being sued by 3 different creditors for fraud. He was testing the perimeter defenses of my fortress, looking for a weak point, a crack in the mortar he could exploit to crawl his way inside. He thought my silence was hesitation. He thought I was still the soft, accommodating wife who would eventually cave under the pressure of his charm. He didn't realize I wasn't ignoring him. I was simply drafting the blueprints for his execution. I decided to let the starving dog into the yard, just to see how deep the rot actually went. On a gray, overcast Thursday, I finally replied to his 100th message with a single, cold line. Coffee. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. The roasting plant on 4th. The location was intentional. It was a trendy, high-end cafe built inside one of the very first industrial spaces Marcus and I had restored. Every brick, every exposed steel beam in that building belonged to me. I arrived early, wearing a sharp, structured blazer the color of gunmetal, and sat at a corner table. When Mark walked in, the desperation rolling off him was almost radioactive. He had clearly spent hours trying to look successful. His suit was freshly pressed, his hair carefully styled to hide the thinning patches, but his eyes were bloodshot and manic. He sat down across from me, ordering an expensive espresso he likely couldn't afford. "Clara," he breathed, leaning forward, deploying the old, practiced smile that used to make my heart skip a beat. Now, it just looked like a rotting jack-o'-lantern. "You look incredible. Powerful." I didn't smile back. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice entirely devoid of inflection, slicing through his fake warmth like a scalpel. He flinched, but quickly recovered, shifting into his pitch. He didn't start with apologies. He started with business. He spent 20 minutes talking about his vast experience in the real estate sector, his network of high-net-worth individuals, and how the market was shifting. He painted a picture of himself as a seasoned visionary who had simply hit a temporary rough patch. "I've been following your company's trajectory, Clara. It's impressive, but you're plateauing. You need a partner who understands the high-end acquisitions game. A consultant. I can bring you deals you can't access." The sheer, unadulterated delusion of the man was staggering. He wasn't just begging for a handout. He was actively trying to hustle his way into the executive suite of the empire I built from his garbage. He was eyeing my assets, calculating exactly how much of my wealth he could siphon to pay off his creditors. I sat back, taking a slow sip of my black coffee, the bitter heat grounding me. I let him talk, let him spin his web of lies, watching the frantic, calculating machinery operating behind his desperate eyes. He was laying a trap, hoping my supposed lingering affection would blind me to the reality of his bankruptcy. I set down my cup, smiled a slow, terrifying smile, and agreed to consider his proposal. Back at the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of cutting fluid and burnt carbon. I laid the blueprints of Mark's destruction out on the steel table. Marcus leaned against a support column, arms crossed, the cherry of his cigarette burning bright in the dim light. "You're playing with a cornered rat, Clara," he rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper. "A starving dog will bite the hand that feeds it, just to taste the blood. Don't let him inside the perimeter." I looked at my foreman, the man who had helped me pour the concrete of my new life. "I'm not letting him in, Marcus. I'm building a cage." I had my private investigator dig deeper into the exact mechanics of Mark's impending ruin. The truth I uncovered was darker and more pathetic than I had anticipated. Mark wasn't just looking for a job or a consulting fee. The private investigator handed me a thick, encrypted file detailing Mark's catastrophic legal exposure. His 24-year-old soulmate, Chloe, hadn't just left him. She was cooperating with federal investigators. Mark had been using fraudulent collateral to secure his massive bridge loans. He was facing not just total financial liquidation, but massive civil fraud lawsuits that would strip him down to his bone marrow. But there was a loophole in the state laws regarding asset protection. If Mark were to legally marry a spouse with immense, untethered wealth, a spouse who could absorb him into their corporate structure, he could successfully shield a significant portion of his remaining assets and leverage his new wife's credit to stave off the wolves. His ultimate plan wasn't to work for me. His ultimate plan was to manipulate me into remarrying him, to use my multi-million-dollar empire as a bulletproof vest against his own criminal incompetence. He wanted to infect my healthy, reinforced structure with his terminal rot, fully expecting me to pay millions to save him from prison. The utter contempt I felt in that moment transcended anger. It was a cold, crystalline, absolute zero. He had discarded me when I was a liability, and now he wanted to parasitically attach himself to me because I was a fortress. I looked at the heavily documented proof of his fraud, the red ink glowing like spilled blood on the stark white paper. I didn't just want to reject him. I wanted to psychologically destroy him so completely, so fundamentally, that he would never, ever be able to look at his own reflection again without seeing the rubble of his failures. I picked up my phone and invited him to the most expensive, exclusive restaurant in the city. The restaurant was a dimly lit, suffocatingly exclusive temple of extreme wealth located on the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. It was the kind of place where the lighting was designed to make diamonds sparkle and where the ambient noise was the soft, hushed murmuring of the city's billionaires dissecting the global markets. The air smelled of white truffles, expensive perfume, and raw power. I arrived early, wearing a custom-tailored, blood-red silk suit that fit me like armor. I sat at a prominent corner table, the city lights glittering behind me like a conquered kingdom. Resting on the pristine white tablecloth in front of me was a thick, heavy, black leather dossier. When Mark walked in, he looked like a man who believed he had just won the lottery. He strode across the dining room with that old, swaggering arrogance, his chest puffed out, flashing a practiced, predatory smile at the hostess. He slid into the booth across from me, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "Clara," he purred, reaching across the table, attempting to place his hand over mine. The physical proximity of him, the smell of his fading cologne and desperate sweat, made my stomach violently churn. I smoothly pulled my hand back, my expression entirely unreadable. "Let's skip the appetizers, Mark. You said you had a vision for our future." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, intimate whisper. He launched into a sickeningly rehearsed speech about redemption, about how his time away had taught him that the corporate world was empty without the right woman by his side. He actually had the audacity to suggest that our time apart was a necessary trial to forge a stronger bond. He was verbally paving the road to a proposal, setting the stage to ask for my hand, my heart, and access to my corporate bank accounts. I let him talk for exactly 12 minutes. I let him build the tension, let him construct his delicate, intricate house of cards right there on the white tablecloth. I waited until the waiter poured our $300 glasses of Cabernet, until the surrounding tables were quietly engaged in their own conversations. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I slid the heavy black leather dossier across the table until it hit his water glass with a sharp, heavy thud. "Open it," I commanded, my voice dropping the polite facade entirely, hitting him with the cold, unyielding force of a steel I-beam. He blinked, the predatory smile faltering slightly, and flipped open the cover. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as he stared at his own autopsy. The first page was a copy of his impending bankruptcy filing, the red ink screaming his failure. The second was the civil fraud lawsuit detailing his fraudulent loan applications. The third was a transcript of Chloe's statement to the investigators, detailing exactly how he had squandered his stolen money. Mark stared at the documents, his eyes darting frantically across the pages, his breath hitching in his chest. The silence at our table was absolute, heavy, and toxic. "You're bankrupt, Mark," I said, my voice carrying clearly, deliberately loud enough for the wealthy couples at the adjacent tables to hear. The murmuring around us subtly stopped. Heads began to subtly turn in the dim light. "You are functionally insolvent. You are facing massive civil fraud charges because you lied on your collateral filings. Your 24-year-old soulmate drained your accounts and abandoned you." Mark's mask completely shattered. The suave, confident consultant vanished, replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. The veins in his neck bulged, his face flushing a violent, ugly purple. "Clara, keep your voice down," he hissed, his eyes darting around the suddenly quiet restaurant. Absolute panic setting in as he realized his public image was being slaughtered in front of his peers. "This is a misunderstanding. My lawyers are handling it. I just need a temporary bridge loan, a partnership." "You don't want a partnership." I cut him off, my voice slicing through his lies with surgical precision. "You want a human shield. You want to legally attach yourself to my assets so my company can absorb the shockwave of your criminal incompetence. You threw me into a burning building 7 years ago, and now you want me to pay for the privilege of putting out the fire you started." He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, the sheer, ugly desperation morphing into vicious, pathetic anger. "You owe me," he snarled, dropping the charm entirely, revealing the entitled, narcissistic monster underneath. "I gave you that warehouse. I gave you the foundation." I actually laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You gave me a toxic ruin strapped with $500,000 of your hidden debt. I paid for that warehouse with my blood. You are a structural failure, Mark. You are a condemned property." I stood up, smoothing the front of my red suit. I looked down at him, a shivering, utterly destroyed man trapped in a prison of his own making. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my purse and dropped it onto the dossier. "That's for the coffee you bought me yesterday. Consider all your debts to me paid in full." I turned my back on him and walked out, leaving him drowning in the deafening silence of the room. I stepped out of the skyscraper and into the bracing, freezing bite of the winter air. The city lights blurred around me as I climbed into the back of my waiting car. My phone buzzed once, a final, furious, incomprehensible text from Mark that I deleted without even reading. The block was permanent. The excision was complete. The drive back to the warehouse was quiet, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet asphalt acting as a soothing metronome. When I walked through the massive bay doors of my headquarters, the cavernous space was empty and silent. The harsh halogen lights illuminated the towering racks of reclaimed steel, the massive, old-growth timber beams waiting to be repurposed, and the intricate, beautiful ironwork I had dragged from the ashes. The air smelled fiercely of cold steel, progress, and absolute, undeniable safety. I walked over to the steel drafting table where Marcus had left the blueprints for our next major acquisition. I traced my fingers over the precise, highly structured architectural lines. 7 years ago, I thought my life had ended in a sterile kitchen, crushed under the weight of a betrayal that felt entirely unsurvivable. I thought the fire Mark started had burned me to the ground. But standing here, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my resilience, I realized the profound, gritty truth about destruction. Fire doesn't just consume, it purifies. It burns away the dead wood, the weak mortar, and the illusions we build our lives around. Mark had tried to bury me under his debts, but he didn't realize he had buried me in a forge. The pressure, the pain, and the sheer, brutal necessity of survival had hammered the soft, accommodating woman I used to be into something completely unbreakable. I didn't just survive his betrayal. I used it as the fuel to build an empire that will outlast us both. To anyone currently standing in the wreckage of a life someone else destroyed, remember this: the debris is not your grave. The debris is your raw material. Do not wait for an apology that will never come, and do not let a coward convince you that you are fundamentally broken. Pick up the heaviest piece of iron you can find, strike the match, and start building your fortress. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft amber glow of the security lamps, completely at peace in the house I built myself.